Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining our 18th annual conference on the theme of what does race have to do with religion? Racialization and Worldwide Islam. I'm Arpan Mandari, co-president of the Duke-UNC Islamic Graduate Student Association, along with Kylie Broderick, my co-president. We're grateful that we are able to welcome new panelists and audience members who may not have been able to make the physical trek in previous years. But please bear with us if there are any technical difficulties. This year, we're very fortunate to be able to host 9 graduate or postgraduate students showcasing their research, 3 artists who will be presenting their art, and our keynote speaker, Dr. Zarina Grayval. Throughout today and tomorrow, audience members are more than welcome to pose questions in the chat, which Kylie and I will direct to each of the participants in the Q&A section of each panel. Just as a reminder, this entire event is recorded and will be publicly posted on the Duke-UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies YouTube channel after the event wraps up. We are indebted to those organizations and individuals who made this happen today. Special thanks to Emma Harbour, who is Director of Outreach at the Duke-UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies, whose help and guidance made this conference possible. Thank you also to the following organizations whose generous funding has fueled the conference: the Duke-UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies, the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at UNC, the Klein Fund in Global History and Islamic Studies at UNC, the Curriculum in Peace, War, and Defense at UNC, the Department of History at UNC, the Department of Religious Studies at UNC, the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at UNC, Duke University's Islamic Studies Center, as well as Duke University's Middle East Studies Center. Thank you. Join us on each panel today and tomorrow by following along with the itinerary with embedded Zoom links, which we will post in the chat just now. With that said, we will get started with our first panel. Alrighty, so are our panelists ready to go? Alrighty. So our first panel is Identity Formations and Formation, and our respondent will be Dr. Cemil Aydin from the University Department of History, UNC Department of History. Our first presenter is Mahmoud Awil Mohamed, who is a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, studying Heritage Studies and Public History with a focus on the Islamic world. Mohamud will be presenting his paper entitled Up from the Margins, Black Muslim Youth on Race and Racialization in a Cohort-Based Community. Thank you, Mohamud.
Thank you, Arpan. I'm good to share my screen?
Yeah, you should be good.
All righty. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Duke-UNC Consortium for the opportunity. It's really been a culmination of a lot of research, so I'm excited to share this paper with all of you today. This paper is called Up from the Margins, Black Muslim Youth on Race and Racialization in a Cohort-Based Community. It chronicles a set of interviews and surveys conducted with members of a cohort called DREL, the Deeply Rooted Emerging Leaders Program, run by the Muslim Wellness Foundation and under the leadership of Dr. Cemil Rashad. I myself was a participant in this program in the year 2018, for full context. So we're going to start with a really quick quotation from Arnett and Brody in their 2008 study, Identity as a Fraught Location for African-American Youth. Identity issues are more complicated and difficult for African-American emerging adults than for emerging adults in other American ethnic groups. And this is for a number of reasons, but really we'll get into this in a few moments here. So simply, before we start on terms, for the purpose of this conversation, I will utilize the terms African-American as meaning Americans born descendant of enslaved Africans, and I'll use the term Black used broadly to mean used to closely connote all African descended people from the continent of Africa and from the diaspora in the Western Hemisphere. And this comes courtesy of Dr. Cemil Rashad in her 2020 unpublished thesis. I feel this is the best way to delineate these differences simply because it's the most inclusive and it's the easiest to differentiate between these two strains of African or Blackness in the US. This is a quick picture of the 2018 Deeply Rooted Emerging Leaders cohort. Pictured are some of my cohort members, really wonderful people who, without their help, this study would not have been possible. And so really, what is DREL? right? So established in 2017 by the Muslim Wellness Foundation, DREL is a fellowship program that centers Black Muslim emerging adults between 18 and 25, and that's a specific age group that they seek to develop. And the goal is to build capacity for critical self-reflection, cultivating resiliency, and establishing leadership capacity. And all of this is done through kind of building a cohort-based community of many Black Muslim youth from across the US who are leaders in their own communities, and having them come together over 2-3-day intensive retreats where they then brainstorm and build small group action projects and service projects in their own communities. And we'll see the outcomes of these projects in a moment here. So some demographic data. The cohort tends to skew female, right, with students who are, with members who are cisgender identifying females at 55%. Cisgender males make up 46% of the cohort. The ethnic composition breakdown, and so I use these categories broadly, even though there's a lot of diversity and variation within them, but African American generally being 20% of the cohort, that is 3 out of 15 students, and 1 member of the cohort being of Jamaican descent. West Africans making up 3 out of 15 members of the cohort, or 20%, 2 Senegalese members and 1 Sierra Leonean member. East Africans making up 8 out of 15%, really the largest chunk. They represent the lion's share at 53.3%, 6 from Somalia and 2 from Sudan, and Afro-Caribbean, 1 member of the cohort being descendant of Jamaican descent. The age breakdown between 18 and 25, we see that the lion's share again goes to 18 to 22, sitting at 53%, and the smaller contingent being made up of 22 to 25, kind of that older portion, the upper quartile, being made up of 46% of the cohort. The geography skews urban, with a lot of members coming from suburban areas outside of large metro areas, and then 40% of the cohort coming from kind of the urban center. And this has, its own implications, but yeah, we'll get to that in a moment here as well. Really, the outcomes of DREL are based around kind of these 3 essential areas, right? Community, the development of an organic, tight-knit cohort of scholars, actors, and change makers working at the grassroots level in and across the Black Muslim diaspora. Khidma, which is the kind of Islamic term for service that encompasses both a worldly and a spiritual aspect. And when this word came up a lot in the oral interviews, right, people seeking to be khadimin to both their communities and kind of their larger Black Muslim family. And then mentorship, right, filling at times both the role of mentor and mentee. And this is really to develop intimate networks of access and support. And we know that the value of mentorship is that when you create these networks, they open doors that otherwise would not have been open. This is senior scholars working with junior scholars, senior community members working with younger community members to build these cross-generational networks of support. And the research on this is really, there's a dearth of research on this. This shows that this is how we maintain and build communal networks that are both effective and have a level of longevity. So the methodology here was a set of research, it was a qualitative research survey with 12 members of the community and oral interviews with a few of them, right? And the analysis was focusing on the ideas of race, racialization, racial consciousness, and how to build gaps in understanding, of our communal Blackness. And really, without the help of the cohort, this would not have been possible, right? Really, we're looking to find out what the data can elucidate about the fraughtness of emerging Black adulthood and the ability of cohort-based communities to combat that. We know that Black emerging adulthood and the passage into that adulthood is beset by a series of challenges, both socioeconomic, political, right, that have kind of a crippling effect on our ability to move in the world, right? And really the final goal is to compare this against national trends, right? I sourced this from Pew data, the Institute for Policy, Social Understanding, IPSU, did a flagship study in 2017 of Black Muslim youth. And we're gonna kind of weigh it against that data later on in the end. So let me minimize this here. When we talk about racial consciousness, and this is defined by Carter in the 2015-2005 study, critical race consciousness is the critical understanding of the asymmetric power relationships that exist between Blacks and whites in America. And this colors really the lived experience of every Black person in this country for a number of reasons. So the question that I pose is, when did our members develop a level of critical race consciousness? When were they first aware of their standing in America as Black people? And we identified really 3 critical junctions: early adolescence, teenage years, and adulthood, or emerging adulthood, the phase that they would have been in when they entered the program. The overwhelming majority of the survey participants, upward of 70%, reported acquiring this consciousness of early adolescence in kindergarten, the first grade, or elementary level, right? So in that early period of life. And we see this because, and often, they allude to their parents instilling in them their being Black, their Blackness. And they carry that with them throughout their teenage years and into adulthood. Fewer members reported that in the teenage years and the adult years. And that's as a result of, how they were socialized, but also the dynamics of their families, perhaps their culture and ethnic backgrounds, whether they came from continental African families or they came from African-American families. There was an interesting difference. And I found that very often that African-Americans, the two members of our cohort who were African-American, are identified that way, their Blackness was immediately instilled in them. Whereas continental Africans who arrived later, some as late as the 90s, for example, myself and my own family coming in 93, Blackness was something you grew into eventually as you interact with more Black people, right? And as you began to explore your Blackness, you also began to explore the idea of racialization. Carter defines racialization as the historical process that gives race its social, cultural, and political meaning, and that determines how such meaning is deployed ideologically and through various practices and institutions. It is the ongoing recreation of new meanings, groupings, and associations between racial hierarchy and the categories that it compromises. Now, this is interesting because the thrust of this thesis is that immigrant Africans are racialized into African American society by way of being lumped and grouped into that way. And so this, we'll see later on, causes tension between the descendants of these immigrant African groups and the already present African Americans, right? We see this as a site of tension and sometimes even as a site of unity, especially when it comes to the delineation between Black identity, kind of a broader umbrella that encompasses really everyone, and then African American identity, a very specific, unique cultural signifier that has a particular history behind it. And as we'll explore, this becomes a site of tension and at times unity for the cohort. So how did Drill 18 members view racialization, and what does racialization mean to them, right? And through our research, I found that to them, racialization was both a cultural and a political endeavor, right? In that immigrant Africans felt they were racialized into African Americana, and African American immigrants felt that there was at times kind of an infringement on their identity by immigrant Africans that didn't really necessarily, I won't say that it was really an issue of respect, but it was an issue kind of cultural sensitivity, and that yes, we all fall under the category of Blackness, but my Blackness is fundamentally different than your Blackness. And while we may share the condition of African American or Blackness in America, these realities are lived in very different ways. And you see that Sherman Jackson talks about this, right? The false universal, how there is a tendency to universalize the experience of African Americans and Black people generally, which isn't true to the socio, political, and economic reality of that very factor, right? And so the cohort itself then becomes both a site of unity and tension, right? Unity in the sense that as a result of this assumed racialized Black identity that both immigrant Africans and African Americans fall under, it encompasses all people descended from the continent of Africa and the diaspora, right, in the Western Hemisphere. And there's cultural markers that signify us as Black Muslims that we share. This is an affinity for kind of, the cohort mentions, and this is from the data, an affinity for social justice, an affinity for really a racial awakening post-Ferguson and the death of Mike Brown, really stepping into their Blackness in their kind of their adolescent years, even if they were socialized into their Blackness in their youth, but kind of the development of an activist identity, being committed to justice and seeing kind of equality for all African Americans as both a tangible responsibility and the goal, but also as a religious obligation, right, as the Black Muslims. And this came up often with the phrase adala, searching for justice in the work that they do. And because the cohort skewed activist in the kind of their socialization, this was a central tenet of how they identified in their own communities and then with each other when they came to the drill cohort, right? But tension was a result of the engagement with specific ethnic, cultural signifiers within Blackness. Here resides the prejudice, exclusivity, and cultural arrogance that both sides complained about the other engaging in. For African Americans, it was the kind of the cultural superiority, the religious superiority that immigrants brought with them, that authority or ownership of Islam and the practice of Islam in the States. And immigrants being socialized to be fundamentally distinct from African Americans. And this is something that we heard a lot when I interviewed folks. As a refrain in their homes or in their cultures, you are different than them, and so forth. You should carry yourself in a different way. And there are a number of slurs and derogatory terms that are used. I won't mention them here for the sake of being respectful, but they're common, right, in a lot of these immigrant families when referring to African Americans. And so the cohort then became a site of unlearning and relearning, right? Unlearning the derogatory nature of how they were socialized to interact with African Americans. And for African Americans, it was learning who are immigrants and what do immigrants, think of us. And really the cohort becomes a site of organic interaction between people who may not otherwise interact. And this is a result of a few different reasons, right? Ethnic enclaves being one I know for myself living in Minnesota. As a Somali, a Somali American in any way, you can grow up and never have a meaningful interaction with a non-Somali person until you get to the college or high school age, because you grow up in an ethnic enclave where every member of your community looks like you, comes from where you come from. And that being socialized in that way, while it builds a strong kind of national and ethnic identity, leaves you slightly ignorant about the cultures and backgrounds of other people. And we see this in other ethnic enclave communities. Our West African members growing up in kind of Senegambie communities in New York, our African American members growing up in historically Black Muslim communities in Jersey, so on and so forth. And so the ethnic enclaves acting as times as both a boon and a detriment. And it's difficult to have that conversation without really understanding that at times you really do need that, and at times it may skew your perception of other people, particularly other Black people, right? And so when we came to the question, has DREL been an effective space, the Deeply Rooted Emerging Leaders Program, to bridge the gap between diasporic Africans and African Americans? The results skewed negative for three primary reasons. The infancy stage of the community building process, in that members only had a total of 6 days across a year to really have these conversations. And even though they were intimate and deeply meaningful, it was still really fresh. And a lot of the connections they were building were happening not in person, but offline, right? They were online, right? They were happening over group chats, text messages, FaceTime, Zooms, and that's really where they were doing the majority of kind of that community building. Intentionality is a missing factor in this conversation. It really needed to be center stage about how do we bridge the gap between continental and diasporic Africans, and what are the results of the racialization and kind of the way we've been socialized to view our Blackness. And really the one that really touched me the most was the fear of disrupting this new familiar integrity, right? When you build these deeply intimate connections with folks you didn't know before, you're scared of jumping into the kind of the waters of I'm this and you're that, we're different, and all of the pain and trauma that can dredge up. And so there was a real hesitancy to jump into that, because the familial unit was really, or the familial integrity of that unit was central to kind of that identity building process early on. And we'll conclude with this, and I know I got a 2-minute warning here. So the conclusions, right? And these are my conclusions based on research. For as much as Black Muslim youth have in common, it seems they are not effectively communicating across ethnic and cultural lines. This is possibly a result of racialized socialization as well as the ethnic enclave event. When we speak across lines, we build organic, structurally strong bonds, and these communities are stronger as a result of that. And really embracing the cohort model of bringing together Black Muslim youth from diverse communities. When you bring into contact these young people who may have otherwise never engaged with each other, the ripple effect is felt well beyond the confines of that original group. And we see that in the projects that have been born out of the DREL program, the Black Muslim Fashion Program, the mentorship programs that have come out, and even the scholarship programs that have come out. And so I wish we had more time, but that's our 15-minute limit. Now I'm respectful of our other panelists. I want to thank the Duke-UNC Consortium, and I hope in time the paper will be available so people can really engage with the research more substantively. But I thank you guys, and I will pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Emma, for that wonderful talk. We'll be moving on to our second person. Just a reminder that the respondents will do their portion at the end of the panel, and the Q&A will also follow at that time. So right now we're just going to keep on moving through the panelists first. Our second panelist is Julio César. Julio is a PhD candidate in religious sciences Complutense University of Madrid in Spain. He is a master's candidate in Islamic culture. He is a master's candidate in Islamic culture from the Islamic University of Medina, Saudi Arabia. Julio will be presenting his paper titled "The Relationship Between Race and Religion." Go ahead, Julio.
The relationship between race and religion from Ibn Taymiyyah into modern Islamism. This paper is limited to discuss two research problems: the relationship between the Arab race and the Islamic religion mentioned by Muslim scholars, and the construction of a concept of race which led to the separation between Arabs and non-Arabs, and to a division between new Muslims and Muslim by birth that splits the Islamic communities within. This social construction has wanted to link religious sources such as the Quran and the Sunnah with the theological opinions of scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and with the legal opinions of last century Muslim scholars such as Ibn Baz, Ibn Uthaymin, and Al-Albani, to present a social division but not a theological nor a legal issue: race and religion in Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah presents the relationship between religion and race, as well as the difference between the Arab race and the foreign societies in one of his legal verdicts. He says, and most of the scholars, Jumhur al-Ulama, agree that the race, genes of the Arabs is better than the others, but the preference from one race in general, tafdil al-jumla, over another race does not involve that all individuals qualified of that race are better than the other individuals of other races and people. Because amongst the non-Arabs, غير العرب, there are people, خلق, much better than most Arabs. This legal verdict shows that, on the one hand, Ibn Taymiyyah considers that the Arab race in general is better than others because of his relationship with the religion, and that is something that cannot be determined directly in each individual. So, it must be said that the races are not just by themselves praiseworthy or laudable, but because of their characteristics. And this is the Ibn Taymiyyah's fundamental opinion on the racialization of the religion. Likewise, Ibn Taymiyyah presents the religion beliefs al-i'tiqad of the people of tradition and the community, Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, about the superiority of the Arab lineage and race. In his book on the need for the straight path, Iqtida Sirat al-Mustaqim, he says the race of the Arabs, Jins al-Arab, is superior, afdal, than the non-Arabs, al-A'jam, whether they are Hebrew, Syrians, Roman, Persians, and other races. The tribe of the Quraysh is the best of the Arabs. The clan of Banu Hashim is the best of Quraysh, and the messenger of Allah is the best of Banu Hashim, because he is the best of the creations, khalq, and the best in his lineage, nasab. And the superiority fadl of the Arab after Quraysh and then Banu Hashim not is given only because the Prophet is an Arab, even if there is a part of the superiority in it, but because they in themselves Anfusihim are superior afdal to the races. Ibn Uthaymin, 8 centuries later, comments this text of Ibn Taymiyyah and says, about this superiority of the Arabs, there is no doubt, la shakka fihi, since Arabs are the best race of human beings, afdal jins bani Adam. And that is why Mohammed is one of them, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he presents this claim because of the Arabs' relation with the race of the Prophet. So, both scholars present the superiority of the Arab race because of their relationship with the Prophet. And as has been explained, an Arab racial superiority will not encompass all Arabs. Ibn Taymiyyah assumes that Muslims know the rise haqq of the Arabs, their racial virtue, fadl, and their precedent, sabiqa, in their arrival to Islam, and propose that a Muslim, regardless of his race, must love Arabs. Ideas that are not based on the Holy Quran, nor in the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, but are founded on some weak prophetic sayings such as those quoted by Ibn Taymiyyah himself. The first one of them is the love of the Arabs is faith, iman, and hating them, بغضهم, is hypocrisy, nifaq. Secondly, whoever deceives Rasha, the Arabs, will not receive my intercession, shafa'ati, in the afterlife, and my love, mawaddati, will not come to him. About the later one, Ibn Taymiyyah acknowledged that it is a weak, da'if hadith, according to some scholars, and it is concerned a lie, kadhib, about the Prophet, according to others. Finally, Ibn Taymiyyah quotes another saying, only the hypocrite, munafiq, hates the Arabs, and considers this hadith reprehensible, munkar, according to the science of the hadith. So, all the sayings about the superiority of the Arab race are weak, da'if, or they are reprehensible, munkar, and do not constitute sufficient Islamic proof to affirm that the Arab race in general is better than the others. But these sayings are quoted in the context of Ibn Taymiyyah's book about the Muslims' need to differentiate themselves from other religion groups, as well as the Arab differs from other races. Race and religion in modern Islamism. Ibn Baz was asked about the prophetic sayings concerning the superiority fadl of the Arabs over other races. So he replied, all these texts, according to our knowledge, are weak, da'ifa. They are not real prophetic sayings. Some of them are false, batil, and others possess some degree of weakness, fihi da'f. However, the Arabs have an advantage, miza, over the other races, since they are related to the family of the Prophet and God sent the Prophet among them. And in their tongue, they also have an advantage for these characteristics. They transmitted Hamalu, the Islam, belonging to the Prophet's family. They were the first to carry Islam and to spread it among the people, so they have an advantage and a right, haq. So you should know, addressing to the Muslims, that the Arabs have their values, and you must know their merits. And I mean the Arabs who entered Islam, took it to the people, taught it, and became role models in goodness, al-khair, such as the companions of Sahaba. May Allah be pleased with the Arabs and with the Arabs who brought Islam with them. Therefore, the Arabs, companions of the Prophet, have a preference and an advantage over the Arabs and non-Arabs. In his answer, he speaks about the advantage, the preference, and the right of the Arabs over other races because of their closeness to Islam and to the family of the Prophet, not because of their racial background. Likewise, in other of his long verdicts called Criticism to Arab Nationalism, Ibn Baz begins, no Muslim with the slightest discernment, basira, of Islamic history have doubts about the preference of Muslim Arabs and what they did to carry the message of Islam. Thus, Ibn Baz brings together the superiority of the Arab race with its historical role in the divulgation of Islam. Later on, his student Ibn Uthaymin clarifies that the lineage al-nasab does not benefit, la yanfa' the Muslim, if he doesn't perform virtuous works or delays them. So Ibn Uthaymin says, there is no doubt that the lineage has an influence, and it is an advantage, and that is why we say that the Arab race is better than the others, and Banu Hashim is the best tribe of the tribes of Quraysh. The lineage has an influence. It is so because the natural characteristics of Arabs, because Arabs are better at understanding, al-faham, in persistence, as-shaja'a, and knowledge, al-ilm. But if Arabs do not do good deeds, then they become worse, sharran, than other races. For this reason, the Arab people should not be deceived by their lineage, but should worry about doing good works so that they can reach the highest degrees and God will be the one who accepts them. Again, the social, physical, and intellectual characteristics of the Arab are mentioned alongside the religious one to show that the Arab race is important only if they are related to the fulfillment of the religion by doing good works. And on the contrary, the Arab race by itself is not a sufficient criterion to speak about its superiority over other races, and could be a disadvantage for the Muslim who, being an Arab, does not observe Islamic norms. In his compilation of weak prophetic sayings, Al-Albani presents a fabricated hadith, mawdu', that is to say, false hadith, namely, if Arabs are humiliated, Islam is humiliated. Mentioning it, Al-Albani also cites another hadith, well known for its authenticity. There is no superiority, la fadal, of an Arab over a non-Arab, a'jami, but by piety, at-taqwa. Al-Albani explains this last prophetic saying like this: that hadith does not deny, yunafi, that the race of the Arabs is the best afdal of all races among the peoples, That's what I believe, أؤمن, I have faith, أعتقد in it, and I fulfill my religion for God. Even though I am Albanian, I am Muslim, thanks to God, this superiority is because of what I have mentioned about the superiority of Daliya of the race of the Arabs, which is the opinion of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And it is so indicated by a set of prophetic sayings on this subject. So, this scholar of Hadith warns the Arabs, such as Ibn Uthaymin did it, not to rely on the superiority of the race by saying to them, but this superiority should not lead an Arab to be arrogant, al-iftikhar, because of his race, because that is a part of the action of the time of ignorance, al-jahiliyyah, that our Prophet Mohammed invalidated. Peace and blessing of Allah be upon him. And we must not ignore that the cause, as-sabab, that distinguished the Arabs to possess such preference, that is, for which they are special, is their intellect, language, ethics, and actions, which led them to be the bearers of the Islamic divulgation to the other peoples. So, if the Arab know this and maintains it, they could be like their predecessors, a legitimate members to make the divulgation of Islam. But if such characteristics are erased, then they had no merit for being Arab. But on the contrary, the non-Arab who follow Islamic edicts, al-akhlaq al-Islamiyya, will be better than them without a doubt, because the true merit is to follow the faith and knowledge sent by Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In this case, Al-Albani goes further than Ibn Uthaymin and argues that the superiority of the Arab race is not only due to its physical and intellectual characteristics, but to its function within the Islamic community, spreading Islam and following Islamic edicts. But if they lose those characteristics or do not fulfill their work in the divulgation of Islam, such superiority becomes the opposite. And any non-Arab Muslim with such characteristics and work becomes superior to the Arabs. Some conclusions. The idea of the superiority of the Arab race is historical, social, and cultural, but not legal or theological. Even so, such superiority is retaken in the Muslim Arabs by birth and in the new non-Arab Muslims, and the verdicts that are given for and from the Middle East with Muslim majorities and rich Muslim minorities in Western countries without going through an adequate sociological or Islamic adaptation. Hence, their interpretation and implementation can be harmful for Islamic communities. This kind of racialization of Islam creates conflict and divisions within and outside Muslim communities, with other social and religious groups, especially in non-Arab territories with Muslim minorities. And although it is related to Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas, his opinions belonged to the realm of religious controversy, in which he compared the resemblance of the Arabs to non-Arabs to reach the discourses of social media and mosque corridors. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you, Julio. And our final panelist for today is Allison Kanner-Botan, who is a PhD candidate in the Divinity School and Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Allison will be presenting her paper titled Pure Beings of Paradise. Well,
thank you so much, and thanks Arpan and Kylie for organizing this great conference, and to my fellow participants, and thanks as well to you all for attending. So I'm going to now share my screen. Okay, and here we go. Okay, so my paper is called Pure Beings of Paradise, Colorism and the Figure of the Huri in the Quran and Early Islamic Hit Romance. So in Ayuki's 11th century romantic epic, Warqa al-Ghul Shah, the narrator first introduces Ghul Shah with this description. As for the one who called Halal, he had a daughter who was an exemplar of the Huris, or Hura Misal. She's a well-cut cypress, full of offerings in the spring. She's full of repute and honor. And her father gave her the name Ghul Shah, for she was sun-faced and of the Huri's lineage, or Hura Nishad. So giving epithets of beauty common to the genre, the narrator here twice reinforces Ghul Shah's semblance to a Huri, concluding that she should ultimately be seen as one of their stock. Such an allusion immediately leads to certain questions. What exactly is a Huri? And for those who have some idea to the answer to that question, what does it mean that this particular woman is of the Huri's lineage, or Nijad? Translation of the term Huri immediately poses problems, as there is not an equivalent term in English, and its usage in the Quran has led to various translations ranging from splendid companions and heavenly maidens to lovely-eyed ones and pure beings. So these somewhat obscure creatures made national news in the early 2000s after Christoph Luxemburg suggested that they ought to be translated as white raisins. Though this theory has been largely dismissed by Quranic studies scholars today on philological as well as literary grounds, it enjoyed popularity in the American press post 9/11, wherein it was claimed that the white raisin theory could solve Islamic terrorism, the logic being that the fervor of suicide bombers would wane once Muslims realized it was actually 72 white raisins, not 72 virgins that awaited them in paradise. Such reductive logic has clear political motivation and assumes a homogeneous understanding of Islamic paradise, if not of Islam writ large. So instead of offering a definitive translation, I'll point to Quranic ambiguity around the usage of the term Huri in order to better understand how early Islamic hit romances, such as Warqa al-Ghul Shah, adopt the figure as a way of defining the beloved's beauty and noble lineage. I will briefly sketch some possible etymologies before discussing Quranic usage, with a special emphasis on Surat Ar-Rahman, wherein paradise imagery is particularly prominent. I will then look towards how the term is used in the love poetics of early Islamic romance, and building off the scholarship of Howard Block. By love poetics, I mean the discourses that govern our erotic imagination and articulations of love as an ideal in various historical moments. And so why this sort of love poetics is important for me today is thinking about beauty standards. So within the beauty standards of early Islamic love poetics, I argue that there is a distinct preference for whiteness or lightness of skin tone. Poets repeatedly allude to the ideal type as both associated with a lightness of skin and a highness of lineage, signaled in their redeployment of the figure of the Huri. This redeployment can be read as an instance of race making, and I borrow from Geraldine Hang's definition of race and race making in the medieval European context, which you can see here. She states, race is one of the primary names we have, meaning moderns as opposed to people of the pre-modern period. A name we retain for the strategic, epistemological, and political commitments it recognizes, attached to the repeating tendency of the greatest import to demarcate human beings through differences among humans that are selectively essentialized as absolute and fundamental in order to distribute positions and powers differentially to human groups. She goes on to define race making here and ends with saying that race is a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences rather than a substantive content. So arguing against those who may stipulate that race is a modern category, Hang underscores that the terminology is nevertheless relevant for thinking with the past. The attention within her definition to historicity allows for recognition of the structural tectonics of race making that are always historically contingent. Thinking with the medieval Islamic romance, I argue that the elevated status of the Huri and its attendant whiteness demonstrates an instance of the structural relationship of race-making present in the medieval Islamic world by connecting whiteness with the desirability and the noble lineage of an idealized beloved. Okay, so jumping in to looking at some instances from the Quran, scholarship on the Quran in English has grown tremendously in the past 2 decades. I'm gonna kind of skip past the literary review and just suggest that I am building on literary approaches to the Quran by suggesting an instance where it is valuable to not only read the Quran as literature, but also with and against literature. And so the Quran concretely mentions huriyat 4 times, which you can see here. In these instances, the Quran never explicitly says who or what the huris are, but rather alludes to them in passing, which has led to much ink spilled by modern scholars and historical thinkers alike over the term's overall etymology and meaning. Sidney Griffith has debunked Christoph Luxemburg's aforementioned white raisin theory by illustrating how it depends on a presumption that the entirety of the Quran is derived from a selection of Syriac hymns. More likely etymologies include a potential relationship to the Pahlavi hurust, or beautiful, used in works such as Arda Viraz to depict the beautiful damsels of a Zoroastrian paradise. On the other hand, instead of assuming it as a foreign word, classical Arabic lexicons tend to state it is derived from the form of the verb hara, meaning to make white. And Lisan al-Arab particularly insists that the term is meant to point to the contrast of black and white in the eye. Moreover, these inhabitants of paradise are metaphorically compared to well-hidden eggs, or bayd, the whiteness of which is etymologically signaled in the bayyada root, and pearls, or lu'lu. Exegetical commentary tends to resolve such lexicographical confusions. Tabari and Ibn Kathir maintain that huris are extremely beautiful, wide-eyed virgins whose color is the white of pearls, that do not menstruate, bear children, and are pure and clean of any bodily excretions. While these early exegetes emphasize sexual purity, the resonance of whiteness from the Quran also remains sort of a prominent trait alongside the physical contrasting with the blackness of the eye. So I'll now turn to Surat ar-Rahman's paradise imagery in order to explore later intertextual potentials with Varkal Gul Shah, as well as to give a more contextualized sense than these sort of little snippets that you see here of these otherworldly beings' presence in the Quran. So Surat ar-Rahman begins with this heightened focus on symmetry. The act of creation is repeatedly described as balanced and new and measured. Moreover, the concern for duality is maintained in each act of creation and finally affirmed in the final verse, which utilizes the dual form and becomes a refrain throughout the rest of the surah, here translated as, which of the favors of your Lord will the two of you deny? It remains ambiguous who the two of you are. It's men and jinn, or women and men, and living and dead, perpetuating a sense of ambiguity while simultaneously emphasizing the balance that is crucial to the surah's overall concern with symmetry. So after a section of more enigmatic signs of creative bounty and a brief description of hell, Surat ar-Rahman turns to paradise, wherein this sense of duality continues. Gardens, springs, and fruit come in to appear in pairs, while the surah also presents the banquet imagery of carpets with gold brocade, rubies, and coral. The repetition of the refrain counterbalances each new promise with a warning, propelling the listener to keep listening. Beauties of shy glances, or qasirat, are first introduced here as a potential reward to the believer, yet the description of paradise doesn't end, but rather reduplicates itself again. Here, this reduplication of the gardens gives this sense of infinity, that each garden gives way to 2 new gardens. The surah seems to build up to the mention of the huriyat, who are duplicates of the beauties with shy glances on a higher plane. The overall concern with their purity relates them to their more feminized counterparts, yet their distinct non-humanity creates ambiguity and uncertainty about how or if biological sex functions for these paradise creatures in a directly analogous way. Such a repetition that replaces a human with a non-human referent breaks the concrete semantic flow of the imagery and reinserts the sense that paradise is otherworldly. Moreover, while a sense of ambiguity of the physicality of these otherworldly beings remains, circling back to other Quranic references I previously mentioned, the embedded association with whiteness as their color proves to carry powerful symbolic resonance in their literary afterlives. So turning back to Ayuki's 11th century romantic epic, Varkal Gul Shah, I want to give a few just contextualizing remarks as to why I've chosen this particular work before jumping into a few specific examples. So this work lies chronologically at the beginning of a long tradition of writing masnavis, or long narrative poems, in rhyming couplets with romantic themes in the Persianate world. Like its more famous counterpart, Layli o Majnun, this work derives from an Arabic story centered around a quasi-historical ghazal poet, Urwa ibn Hizam. Thought to live within the Prophet Muhammad's own lifetime, attributions of Urwa's poetry often get mixed up with other Umayyad era Udri poets such as Qais ibn Dari, Qais Majnun, Ibn al-Mulawah, and Jamil Buthaina that make up the core of an emerging ghazal movement, whom all thematically portray tragic love. By drawing on this earlier tradition, this work represents a blending of Arabic and Persian love poetics and highlights the standards of beauty shared between the two in this internally diverse medieval Islamic world. So returning to the quote that I cited at the beginning, we see how the narrator introduces us to Gul Shah through appeals to the Huri. Here the Huriyat, or the Hura as they're known in their Persian plural, are the origin of beauty and chastity, and Gul Shah is the human incarnation of their ideal. Moreover, she is described as full of scent and color. Although she's described as full of scent and color, she's also depicted with a certain lightness of facial skin tone, or sun-faced, which is doubly reinforced by her descending from the whitened black-eyed Huriyat of paradise. Varka subsequently imagines Gul Shah as a Huri, which has a powerful effect on him. After Varka has been denied access to Gul Shah a few times in the work, he begins to pace and have visions of her. And so you see here that Gul Shah is this exemplar of the Huris, again, Hura Misal, and he summons her before her like a phantom or a khayal. And he goes forth like this for a few resting stations, and his heart is in the grip of that Huri-eyed one, or Hura-ayn. Here, Gul Shah's likeness to a Huri overpowers Varka. The Quranic intertext is made more apparent through a specific mention of the eyes, and Gul Shah's face is the concrete representation of a Huri's face. So one reference to the Huri by the narrator of this poem throws off any definitive association of the term with femininity. When introducing Varka, the narrator states that among that tribe, he was a lover, Huri-faced and fairy-shaped. Like Gul Shah, Varka had a particularly Huri-like face, signaling that he too embodies the ideal beauty type of lightness of skin contrasted to a certain blackness of the eye. This similarity in appearance is not surprising given the gender-bending dynamics of Islamic love poetry, wherein the beloved can be fluidly masculine or feminine, and the lover, although typically associated with a masculine speaking voice, is typically physically feminized or androgynous. What then emerges clearly is that the figure of the Huri carries stronger colorized, or we might say racialized connotations than gendered ones in the medieval Islamic literature. By retaining its connection to the promise of the afterlife, the Huri as a metaphor functions to idealize beauty by its attendant traits of whiteness, which reversely congeals and makes corporeal this otherworldly referent. So if, as Angelica Neuwirth states, paradise is a space where man is reinvested with his own cultural paraphernalia, then I would argue that we attend to the opposite direction by seeking to understand how the deployment of these paradise beings in the imagery of medieval literature signals colorized and potentially racialized dynamics within the early Islamic world. While the Huri's status as otherworldly beings in the Quran remains to a certain extent ambiguous, the symbolic residue of an association with whiteness is redeployed in literature as a way to signal not only lightness of face, this Hur chehre, but also a highness of lineage, or Hura Nejad, as we saw here. In the expanding environment of early and medieval Islam, we might then ask who could have been concretely imagined as such. Anne-Marie Schimmel has suggested one way of getting at these questions in her article that contrasts rhetorical reference in Persian poetry of the desirable light-skinned Turk with the undesirable or blackened Hindu. Further questions emerge if this is a specifically Persianate imaginary that added layers of conceptualizations of ideal beauty types in an already cosmopolitan environment. What is clear, however, is that lightness of skin was associated with desirability as well as noble lineage, as can be seen in the trope of the Huri-faced lover and beloved. As opposed to blackness, whiteness can be harder to locate. Toni Morrison writes that seeing whiteness in the American literary canon for her was, quote, like looking at a fishbowl. the glide and flick of the golden scales of the fish, the castles at the bottom, and suddenly I saw the bowl, unquote. Translucent, the bowl is nevertheless in a relationship with what's inside. Thinking back to Heng's definition of race making as a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences, in this paper I have shown how the Huri entered the vocabulary of Islamic love poetics as a metaphor for the highly desirable and whitened beloved. This ideal signals then what was seen as less than ideal, and thus provides a glimpse of the racializing logic present in the medieval Islamic world. This world can contribute a new archive to the historical and comparative study of racialization, which purports to offer a deepened understanding of the troublesome racial logics that still haunt our present. Thank you very much. That's the end for me.
Thank you so much, Allison. We will now move to the discussant's comments on your papers. The discussant for this panel is Dr. Cemil Aydin, who is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina. Dr. Aydin, please go ahead and say all three of your comments to the panelists now. They will respond afterward. Thank you.
Thank you, Arpan, and thank you to the co-organizers, co-directors, and the center and Emma. This is a fantastic group of papers. I really enjoyed reading them, but also it's very impressive how in the 18th year, the conference evolved and dealing with contemporary issues of today. So I also enjoyed reading the papers and how they are fitting with each other. And I'm going to talk about the relationship between papers, but start with the chronology, well, in the order that they were presented. And I think in the first paper, Mohamed Awil already set out some of the basic problems that we see in other papers too. So what happens in the dynamics, what he calls unity and tension, the relationship between racialization of Blacks who are from the enslaved background as well as from post-colonial African states. And he discusses how this relationship has certain cultural elements. And I think this topic has been worked by scholars of American Islam, including our keynote speaker, Zarina Grawal, as well as one other discussant, Juliana Hammer, of how some of the immigrant Muslims have that, the culture of authenticity, that they know Islam better than African-American Muslims, and how that idea of being connected to the authentic source of Islam created a sense of cultural privilege within Muslim community. I think the second paper, Julio's paper, deals with that question by looking at Ibn Taymiyyah and some of the Saudi scholars who think that the Arabs are culturally superior because of Arabic and because of their shared lineage with Prophet Muhammad. But Mohamed Awil's paper does also other great insights by reference to Sherman Jackson's false universal in discussing unity and tension. I think a lot of people talked about this is when President Obama was elected, and also with regard to Ilhan Omar, is that what happens if you don't come from the same underprivileged background? Are you the same level of African American, right? In the case that the President Obama has never, I mean, he grew up in this kind of middle class family with partly white parents, but he then, embraced that African American identity, and he was accepted as African American. His lifestyle, his political decisions, his politics, his marriage, and that can be similar to Ilhan Omar's profile too. That she's racialized twice as both being Black and Muslim, and woman maybe 3 times. In that sense, I think this paper sheds light on the kind of dynamics of racialization as a Muslim because of Muslimness, and racialization because of Blackness. And I really enjoyed kind of seeing what happens in the conversations that Mohamud describes in these gatherings among Muslims from different backgrounds linked to Africa. And I think I will get back to this question of racialization as both a cultural and political process. And I think this then becomes very clear in Julio's paper, and then it will get back to Mohamud's paper again. And he then talks about this question of pride in Arab cultural superiority that is traced back to Ibn Taymiyyah, but to earlier scholars, and how it's being justified. And then how it's being discussed in contemporary Saudi Arabia. There were three scholars whose life extended all of 20th century in Saudi Arabia. And of course, the question of when is the advantage of being an Arab or Qurayshi or being Sayyid become a sign of racial superiority. And it's really rich in details, and I think Julio gets to the core of this question of what happens to the universalist message of Islam of equality of all under one God, and how it's being historically being betrayed in some ways by this discourse that some Muslims are better than others because of their cultural superiority. But he also knows how this has always been some sort of a conditional one, that Arabs are superior as long as they fulfill a certain set of criteria. And that this moment actually happened even in European history of European racism, that there was one point in the late 19th, early 20th century that is extended to figures like Arnold Toynbee and a lot of British internationalist racist figures who are saying that yes, there is no sharp racial distinctions among humans, but the West is still superior because of the Hellenistic Greek legacy. So there, and then non-Westerners like Japanese and sometimes Turks, they can be Western if they fulfill that criteria. And then some Europeans might actually then be shunned out, and the lower class Europeans were not educated. They're embarrassing the West, that they're not really truly Western, and you can make this distinction. And it seems like there was some sort of a similar discussion on this Arab privilege, superiority, and cultural pride in this context. But my question, and it links to the first paper as well as the third one, is that how does this function in terms of creating a not theological, but a legal, economic, political discrimination in Saudi Arabia and also in other Muslim societies? If you look from this kind of very long-term perspectives, I find that Ibn Taymiyyah's pride in Arab superiority very ironic, because he's the one who wrote these refutations of the Ilkhanate kings saying that why do you feel so much pride of being from the Mongolian Genghis background? It seems like he didn't really keep that universalism himself, because the Ilkhanites, even when they became Muslim, they were proud to be Muslim, but they were very proud to be Mongolian. And the question that arises is that did this Arab pride affect patterns of enslavement, political recruitment, political decisions? And we see, there are cases, of course, is that in Saudi Arabia today or in the past, obviously being an Arab was a privilege that people have used, but there are also examples where, because Islamic tradition was also read and commented by the Turks and the Persians, they can read all the same evidence against the Arabs. So there are two processes, is that post Ibn Taymiyyah, most of the Muslim dynasties were ruled by non-Arabs from Mamluks, who actually have an interesting slave background, such as the Mamluks. But that these non-Arabs, obviously they may have a strong respect for the Quraysh and Prophet Mohammed and the Sayyids. So there is some sort of Arab privilege remains in that respect for that. But they also, you often quoted the hadiths and the sayings that the Bedouins Arabs are just not as cultured and polished as the Turks and the Persians and the others. And it will be good to, as a later iteration of your project, to look at how these ideas being instrumentalize and turn into functional process, and how it's also being used by the people who are weaker and affected by this type of cultural prejudice and racialization processes. And I really like the terms that use, that you can be culturally superior, but that's an advantage. You shouldn't be arrogant. It seems people have to give a lot of content to it, which has similarity to some of the elite white supremacism, is that it's not just the skin color, it's the culture, the education. And I'm curious now whether these things have any functional impact on the way current Saudi Arabian society works, given that they have so much non-Arab labor force in the country, whether they have some of the discrimination applied to them is justified through this language that those non-Arab Muslim labor force come from an inferior understanding of Islam. And then as many of the scholars noted, that even in America, there is this idea that Arabs have a privileged access to authentic Islam. Hence, they are better than other Muslims, and the Turks and the Persians and Indians. There is a lot of resistance to this, but then some of the Arabs might think the same way. And in that spirit, I really enjoyed reading Allison's paper. Nizami's Layli ve Mejnun is a story that we grew up with, but this story of Warki and Gulshah, I did not know much about. It seems there are many other versions of these stories. And it is really fascinating to see how this being from the lightness of skin in the paradise for Houris, it reflects a certain level of desirability and the noble lineage, and how it's reflected in the literature of beauty and love, romance. And then the question is that, did this affect any form of racialization? Did this privileging of the lightness of skin impacted the way Muslims racialize each other, but they also racialize others in terms of in the patterns of enslavement practices, and with the reference to Anamir Shimal's article on how Hindus are seen as darker skinned, and the Northern Turks are preferred. And you might see the kind of extension of that in contemporary Bollywood movies, where it may be changing now, but the actors from the Northern India dominated the main characters in the Bollywood movement for a long time, and that pattern might still be continuing in that regard. But and I really also like the way you referenced Geraldine Heng's idea of looking at the roots of racializations in a medieval period, and to see how it's connected to the modern period. And since we are also trying to understand the present, how racialization of Muslims can be understood through these long-term historical background. In that complex, I have a very similar question that I asked Julio, like, how does this impact in daily life? So we know that sometimes the first thing that comes to mind as a historian is that this preference for the lightness of skin actually did not help the woman with the lightness of skin, because they were targeted for enslavement and concubinage. And there is some sort of a story behind why the Cherkess Caucasian woman was the targeted elite concubines and the wives all the way to early 20th century in those regions. But it will be important to check. And the second question is the regional relevance of this analysis, is that there are limits to where these stories go. So if since you're working on this project, what is the geographical expanse of this Layla ve Mejnun type of stories, and whether that prejudice is already there and then is cross-referenced the Quran and reinforced, or whether the reading of the Houris is inspiring, because these were Persians and the Caucasians and the Northerners who wrote these stories, or they're more excited about this, because once you get to Africa or Indonesia, how much of them read these stories, right? That there are limits to it. And in that regard, we could also see some sort of a broader Islamicate world diversity in this regard. So I'm curious, how did scholars from Senegal and Nigeria, how did they interpret when they read these verses, or Indonesia and India? Did they ever pay attention, or did they skip that part? Whether it also have an impact in those areas. So then circling back to the first paper and the relationship among all three is that we are, of course, now trying to understand the puzzle of the racialization, race making, and racialization of Muslims. And then there is some sort of now put the mirror back to Muslim societies and see that beyond the racialization of Islam and Muslims in the Western societies, that Muslims have different forms of racializations among themselves. And then one line of analysis says that this, some of the anti-Black prejudice in Muslim societies may have been the internalized European epistemic categories of race, which clearly is true in the late 19th, early 20th century. But there's also resistance to it, right? That the Muslims ended up redefining Islam as an anti-racist religion in the 20th century, all the way leading to Malcolm X. So it seems like all of these papers then are telling, teaching us that there is a very much longer history of race-making, cultural prejudice, and racialization. And it is then a good topic to study to see how these longer histories then intersected with our current moment. And in that sense, I congratulate you for writing really great papers, and also thank the panelists to bring these papers, the organizers to bring these papers together in conversation with each other. I guess I made more comments in the questions, but I hope if you can respond to each other's papers and how they relate with your own particular paper, then I would like to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Panelists, feel free to respond to Cemil's questions, comments if you like, or respond to one another, and then we will open it up for the Q&A.
Yeah, I can go first. Thank you, Dr. Cemil. I think your reflection on racialization and race mixing vis-a-vis inclusion or exclusion in Muslim communities is a really interesting idea, especially because I realized that at the conclusion of my research, and this is specific to my community, so I won't speak authoritatively for anybody else, but much of how I was taught to racialize African Americans was born out of a particular racialization or hierarchy of clans and ethnic identities back home in Somalia. And so when we came to the US, there exists in our language derogatory terms that are used toward people that live in the intervening areas in Somalia, Jaded, Mashunguli, which at times can be seen as ethnic or tribal markers, but when used in particular settings are seen as slurs or derogatory. And so it's interesting that when the diaspora came to the shores of the US en masse in the 90s, a lot of how we address our parents' generation, and now I'm learning that, addressed African Americans with those terms, Jaded, Adon, meaning like slave or kinky haired. And so that's really, to the argument that it's an internalized, a product of post-colonial European violence is, in my eyes, not very strong, because this was present well before even the appearance of Europeans on the continent. The racialized hierarchies that existed between Somalis, who separated themselves into categories of Jaded and Jila, right? Kinky haired, soft haired, with particular relation in proximity to Arabs, right? Which was an aspiration towards you mentioned like a Sayyid or Banu Hashim lineage, which northern Somalis and kind of pastoralist Somalis often claim. And they exclude from that genealogy, that lineage, sedentary or inter-riverine Somalis who are of Bantu origin. And so these then have kind of transnational afterlives when we come to the US, and we see that language adopted and then weaponized against African Americans, and really a lot of the bad will and kind of bad blood happens when, subhanAllah, African Americans become aware of that verbiage and that phrasing. And it doesn't do anything to build these strong communities that we're looking to build. And so I think that I certainly, and even to Allison's point about the idealization of white skin existing beyond the reach of colonial entities in our cultures as an aspiration towards Arabness, which is something that Julio touched on. And that's certainly a connection that I see between all three of our papers.
That's very interesting.
I could jump in too, unless if you have a response. Or,
no, I think
thank you so much for all of your comments, Dr. Aydin. That was really helpful. And I think I have a few like productive lines of thought that you sort of gave, because I'm really, I think, coming to like a challenging point in this project where I'm mostly tracing medieval literature, and to think about like the realities on the ground is difficult to like move from the level of the trope to like what's happening sort of historically. And I think that what you said about thinking of targeted women specifically as concubines could be a really productive line of thought, because of all of the, you know, not just in the sort of Layli Majnun stories that like Barkal Gulshah is sort of within this Persianate cultural sphere and can kind of come back to the regional focus there, but that the outside of those stories, say in Arabic epic and the Sira traditions, there is a, I think, you know, certain way of viewing Byzantine women, let's say, or like what the sort of cultural frontiers of interaction and how the romance themes play out by ways of processes of enslavement might be a strong word, but in processes of capturing women who are also seen as desirable. So that's really helpful, and I would love to kind of chat more about that. I think with my fellow panelists, I'm thinking about this like regional focus a lot, because I think Julio and Mohamud both addressed like very well the sort of what Arab cultural supremacy could mean. And I think like with this romance, it's sort of very much participating in a Persianate cultural sphere that I think a line of research I might want to pursue further is thinking about that. You know, I think here I was trying to highlight like what's shared, what could be shared between these two, but also thinking more critically about some of the differences and like the real tensions between these communities, like with, say, Sha'ubi poetics or poetics of like Persian cultural supremacy and how they respond to an Arab sort of conquering force that is both seeing itself as, I think Julio put nicely, of like culturally and religiously sort of superior. So what are all of these layers of that process of racialization? But thank you for these fellow papers and comments.
Julio, would you like to respond? I know you're having some internet connectivity problems.
Yes, of course. First of all, I want to thank all the team, and I want to thank Dr. Cemil for his suggestions. Of course, respect between people is very important and leads to coexistence, to good coexistence. So I can respect someone because he's an Arab, because he's a Jew, because he's a Somalian, and I can share with them their food, their language, anything. And it's very different, that kind of respect than superiority, because the race, because of the religion, because superiority leads to racism. And that's a big problem in Muslim communities. Yeah, big problem. Even Islam does not like racism. So about the hadith instrumentalization, I have another paper in New Mexico in 2 weeks about the medieval and the Quran position for the racialization of Islam. So this paper just was about Ibn Taymiyyah and the modern Islamism. But in New Mexico, I will do something about the Quran and the Hadith and the racialization of Islam with them. About the impact in Saudi Arabia of this kind of superiority, this kind of problems with non-Arab force, I will answer you like with a personal thing. I am from South America. I here live in Medina in Saudi Arabia some years ago with my family, and I do social experiments. When I take a taxi, when I go to airport, when I go to any place, to the mosque, any place, I wear like a Egyptian, like a Maghrebin, like a Saudi, like a Pakistani. Have like an Indonesian, even like a Sudan. So with some people, we just laugh because they know from far away that I am not Sudani. So, but with Saudi people, there is a big difference. The treatment with a taxi driver in a bank is not the same if I wear like a Pakistani or if I speak in English and wear a jeans. That's the about Saudi Arabia right now. The answer, a personal answer. About the question that appears, thanks for the questions. I will say that my work, my PhD work, try to search for the truth about Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. What did he say? What scholars said based upon him, and what are the influence in the movement called Wahhabism. Because this kind of terms, Wahhabism, is very difficult because, as I told you, I study a master in a University of Medina, and I can see by my own eyes, I can see and I can experiment this kind of problems we have with this kind of people. So, for example, I cannot tell all the people here that I am doing this kind of conference because, as I was saying, it's very different making being an intellectual in Arab countries than being an intellectual in United States or in South America. You cannot say everything you have to say. So what I can say in this time is that it is true that there is a violent suppression of theological difference, but also a suppression of a spiritual difference between Muslims, Wahhabi or no Wahhabi. And it is true that there is an exploitation of non-Arabs in Arab countries. This is a real social problem. I can see it all day. But it is also that there is a Arab exploitation of Arab people inside some countries like Saudi Arabia, with Egyptians, for example, with Lebanese. Okay. But I want to know why some scholars in medieval times and right now, they are talking about Arab supremacism or Muslim supremacism, and they took medieval context, medieval ideas into today's practice. I want to know what are the reasons to talk about Arab supremacy. I know that is social reasons, historical, personal reasons maybe, but there are not legal reasons for that, not theological reason for that.
Julio,
So,
I'm going to have to cut you off so that we have time to ask the other questions to the panelists. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So I just want to change the understanding of race so we can get away from racism. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so Mohamud, we have questions for you about explaining more about the schooling of children, if you would be willing to answer that question.
Yeah. I'm not, I feel that I'm still not, I want to answer, earnestly and honestly, I'm not exactly understanding the line of questioning. Maybe Sarah can provide more context. Sorry, I want to answer the question honestly. I will probably be able to say that I think that schooling as a site, pedagogy as a site of identity building something that Carter in the 2005 study talks about at length, especially kind of race-conscious schooling, where children develop a lot of their ideas about race and racialization and how they move in the world in those formative years. And so when students were picking up on that in elementary and first grade and kindergarten, becoming race aware as a result of having race thrust upon you is something that I think we see, and I mentioned this, and the research supports that happens more often for African Americans than for immigrant Africans, because immigrant Africans can still wear kind of the social armor, the shield of ethnicity, culture, and language, and being socialized to be, for example, in my community, Somali before anything else. And you only begin to walk into African American or Black American identity as you progress in life, I think. I hope that clarifies.
Thank you. Allison, I was wondering if you could explain more about how you came to this research topic, what's guiding you here?
Thank you. So my larger research is on medieval romances and specifically Layli and Majnun, the sort of Arabic and Nizami's version. And I think what guided me here was actually first, like, just repeatedly coming across the usage of the huri within these works. And I initially thought, like, oh, it definitely signals this sort of gendered, you know, like making the beloved to be necessarily like virginal or pure. And I think what I found interesting, you know, what kind of took me more in the direction of racialization was then coming across, well, no, it's actually not just used for the female figures, and, you know, thinking a little more about that and about, like, what is it that, you know, these works are often about, like, high class sort of people, and like, what is it about this trope that seems to be, you know, marking beauty? It's not so much about, I think, the femininity. And so it became really interesting to me to see that and to think about, you know, what sort of undertones could be there of what is seen as beautiful, and that it sort of just came as more like about this lightness of skin than about, say, like a certain femininity. So yeah, I think that's how I arrived at, like, this specific paper.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat from, it looks like directed to everybody, from Dr. Hammer. It says, the work to locate race in pre-modern Muslim context sometimes seems like a Euro-American gotcha moment. How do we maintain the sharpness of our political critique of racism as a Euro-American and capitalist phenomenon while not precluding analysis of potentially racial categorizations, etc., in Muslim contexts, past and present? So any three of you are welcome to weigh in on this. Just unmute yourself.
I think it's a really excellent question, and it's something that I have a lot of anxiety about. I mean, I think that what I was trying to suggest in the conclusion of my paper was that, you know, this sort of deep and long history of processes of racialization allows us to expand on, like, what we think consists of that process of race making. But I think some of Dr. Aydin's comments as well, you know, point to how do we think about the import of European colonial racism as its sort of specificity and, like, heightened, you know, globalization. I mean, I am very much someone who's, like, hanging out in the 12th century much more. So that kind of layering, I think, is really important, especially if, like, we want to look to, say, modern resonances. I think some of Mohamud's comments also got at this of, like, well, how do we trace these kinds of modern resonances that are multiple, and that could be imposed from different internal and external forces. I think that requires a lot of kind of care and attention to the specificities, not only of like European colonial racism, but what the specificities of like a pre-modern, in my case, I guess medieval Islamic, what the processes and what like sort of the individual things that we're tracing. So I think like right now I'm like focused on this very narrow thing about this one trope, but being very cautious with what the sort of greater conclusions are.
I think like Allison, and I couldn't help but thinking, in my training, I remember when I went to an Alamiya program when I was younger, memorizing the poetry of Imr al-Qais and the Mu'allaq of Tarafa, and seeing white skin be praised, even though I was kind of how in Imr al-Qais's Mu'allaqa, the skin of the maiden is called like an ostrich, like the white of an ostrich egg, and then seeing like kind of the whiteness of a slender virgin and the Mu'allaq of Tarafa. And so perhaps, and to Dr. Hammer's point, kind of racism as a Euro-colonial endeavor, we need to understand that, I believe, on its own terms, with a particular focus on its afterlives, right, in post-colonial societies. But I think that, like Allison and like Julio, there exists in the medieval tradition certainly a categorization, a racial hierarchy that needs to be understood on its own terms with its own language. And this is something that I think Dr. Miller and Dr. Cemil Rashad, who are both in here, we've talked about at length, about how race was understood by the earliest generations, right? How we see the complexion of Ali ibn Abi Talib referred to as Ahmar, how we see, some of the Sahaba, who were of darker complexion, racialized even in their own time, right? And so perhaps this is both a problem of categories and perhaps a problem of kind of transnational or transhistorical definitions that may not work neatly as we want them to. And so I think understanding Europe, and again, Europe is not my center. It's not where I center my world, but it has dominated how I move in the world. So I think understanding Europe on Europe's terms and understanding kind of the ancient world on the ancient world's terms, and being careful to not transimpose, I guess, particular ideas or realities either way, right? Not to back project and not to forward project, perhaps, which is a kind of a convoluted way of answering Dr. Hammer's question, but I hope it's adequate.
Great. And I think right before we start to kind of taper off this panel, I do have a question for Allison. I'm wondering if, did you ever come across tensions in how the Houris or people depicted as Houris, how did they overcome tensions with autonomy when it comes to describing them, or, when it comes to their like occupation of space and being, and I mean, how much of the agency rested on them versus, because from the examples you showed us, it looked like, it's always the writer projecting onto the alleged Houri or the individual who is similar to a Houri. So I was wondering if you ever came across any instances in which there was some explicit autonomy or there was a self-description, maybe something along those lines, where we can see an interaction rather than a projection.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think in the few instances I gave you, it's just sort of a deployment of this trope that I think it matters a lot who the speaking voice is. So with like, when Varqa, for instance, refers to Gulsha and says like, oh, Hurzad or something, that he's calling her the Houri-born one, and what that's doing to kind of encapsulate her within this trope. Whereas when Varqa himself is referred to as the Houri, it's the narrator using it in passing. I think like there could be a way to get at the subtleties of difference of how much this sort of trope circumscribes anyone's agency, and then how much like within the work itself, like who's using it is sort of further circumscribing the agency of the person they're using it towards. I think if that gets at your question. And I also, I mean, to kind of get at like the undoing of that, I also find interesting, like, I think medieval romance is very much a place of like the making and unmaking of gendered norms, but that there is, you know, so like in Nizami's Layli o Majnun, even though Layli is referred to as a huri, after these long descriptions of beauty, which are very common to the genre, there will at times be, you know, insertions of like, but inside her blood was boiling, and like giving her this interior complexity that I think adds a layer to, you know, of course you go through the sort of beauty standards, but this writing into what is inside, I think allows for a more complex like agent to come into view.
That was great. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to use that in a future project at some point and revisit your comments. So that was really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, and with that, we're now coming to a close on our first panel. So I'd like to thank everyone here. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to Dr. Cemil Aydin for his fantastic response and conversation. I think we had a very, very robust and lively conversation here. I know our questions reflected that, and our comments are definitely reflecting that. So what we're going to do now is head over to our next panel, and you can find the link in the chat. So please head on to that panel if you're interested. That'd be great. It will begin promptly at 11:45, and that is our artist panel. So we will have that right before our keynote speech for this weekend. So hope to see you there, and yeah, we'll get started in about 10 minutes. Thank you.